Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me today. Our lesson is going to address the many compromises that our government attempts in the early 1800s to resolve the issue of slavery in the United States. What new areas coming into the Union will be free and which ones will be slave? The first piece of legislation we want to address is called the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. And you can see the map that takes up a larger portion of your screen is the outcome of that compromise. So the red states you see here are slave states. The blue states are free states. And as we can see here, Maine is going to be admitted as a free state, and Missouri is going to be admitted as a slave state under the Compromise of 1820. Both at the time are petitioning to become states, and they're allowed to choose for themselves. But Congress attempts here to address the larger issue. What about these new territories that are going to come in? Should they be free or slave? And so to avoid any confusion, what the legislature decides to do is to just use a map. And we can see here this black line. This is the 3630 parallel. Runs all the way around the globe. And they decided that any future territory or state below the parallel would automatically be a slave state, and any territory above would become a free state. Now, at the time, there's not a whole lot of unorganized territory. We can see it here. All of it under this agreement will become free area down here. So for a time, this gives us a tenuous peace. But as the early 1800s wear on, Texas declares its independence from Mexico. It also petitions to become a state, which it does. It's below the parallel, so it becomes a slave state. But then, in the outcome of the war with Mexico, under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we gain a lot of territory in the Southwest, and we have to decide what to do with it. So, this map shows us the terms of the next major compromise. It's called the Compromise of 1850. We historians are not very creative namers, please forgive us. But the Compromise of 1850 it is. And under this agreement, we're going to allow California to become a free state. Now, California rides on both sides of that imaginary line, but California is a huge resource to the United States. It is undergoing the gold rush at the time, and so we just want to bring it in as soon as possible, have it be a part of the Union, and so we allow it to choose for itself. But what about these other territories coming in? The people living in these areas do not want to become slave states. Now, it's not all that surprising if you think about it, because the climate in both Utah Territory, New Mexico Territory, what later becomes our state of Nevada and Colorado as well, these areas do not lend themselves to farming. It is an arid climate. And so they don't really have an advantage in becoming a slave state. And under the terms of the Compromise of 1850, they are given the choice whether they will become free or slave, and they choose to come in as free territories. So that's kind of where we leave it as of 1850. Now, by 1854, that unorganized territory that we talked about before, Nebraska and Kansas, now would like to apply for statehood, part of it. Kansas, what we know today as Kansas, will become a state shortly after. And this area, under the agreement of 1820, would automatically be free. But in the southern part of the Kansas Territory, out over towards Missouri, which is a slave state, there are people who would like to see it become a slave territory. So the Congress writes something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Congress attempts to allow the people living in either one of these territories, Kansas and Nebraska, to choose for themselves whether they will be free or slave state or territory. And this is known as popular sovereignty, the right of the people to choose for themselves. And that is what is afforded to the people of Kansas and Nebraska. This leads to an event called Bleeding Kansas, where there's actually violence in the streets of Kansas. Slave owners in Missouri and on the fringes of Kansas actually pay people to come in and vote in the referendum and to vote pro-slavery, even though they don't even live in the state. These outside influences, the country knows this is high-stakes stuff, that as the Midwest goes, so may future territories in the game. So these attempts at legislation, the Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, and also the Kansas-Nebraska Act, are what we now see as futile attempts to resolve the issue of slavery. Ultimately, we end up in a civil war over this issue, not only of slavery, but over popular sovereignty and states' rights. Should a state be able to determine for itself whether it will be free or slave? So tensions are rising, and the Civil War is waiting in the wings. Um, and that's where we'll pick it up in our next lesson. Thank you for joining me today.